Creepy Corridor by Gingerbread. From September of 2007 until April of 2011, I studied history and English online through Lakehead University, located in the small town of Thunder Bay in northern Ontario. During the first week of December of 2007, I finally finished my midterm exams after a painstaking weekend of traveling back and forth between the cities of Cobourg and Oshawa. We decided to celebrate by spending some time with my great-aunt at the Oshawa Shopping Center and getting an early start on Christmas shopping. By the time the mall was about to close, we left for home. Before driving our great-aunt back home, my brother decided to stop for gas. He stepped out of the car to pump it and left me alone in the car with my great-aunt. In order to start up a conversation, I informed her of our summer trip through Gettysburg in August of the same year. She listened with interest to every word, particularly the instance in which we heard the mysterious sounds of rifles during a tour. In response to this, she mentioned one particular incident she experienced many years prior to our conversation, one in which I was never made aware of until that moment. She mentioned that the incident occurred during a trip to Toronto she took with my great-uncle just before Christmas in 1989. They decided to spend the weekend at a luxury hotel and reserved a room on the 7th floor. My great-uncle, exhausted from the trip, decided to go to sleep early. Not wanting to disturb him, my great-aunt decided to leave the room and take a short walk throughout the hotel. After spending roughly an hour wandering the hotel, absorbing her surroundings and admiring the interior design of the building, she lost track of time and decided to head back to their room. The elevator stopped on the 7th floor, and my great-aunt walked nonchalantly back towards her room. She approached it and began quietly unlocking the door to avoid any possibility of waking my great-uncle. She abruptly stopped about halfway as she suddenly felt the most uncomfortable sensation that someone was watching her. She turned apprehensively to her right and immediately realized that her suspicions were correct. Standing in the middle of the corridor was a young boy she assumed to be around the age of 9. She mentioned vividly remembering the boy standing motionless with a completely blank expression on his face. Feeling awkward, she asked him if he was all right or if he was in need of any help. Her question went completely unacknowledged, and the boy just continued to stand in the same spot, staring off into the void as if his full attention was permanently fixated on some mysterious psychological entity. My great-aunt proceeded to turn back to unlock the door, and she decided to ask the uncanny juvenile one last time if he needed something, only to discover he was no longer present. She found herself completely alone in the hallway, and despite feeling extremely uneasy, she decided to not wake up my great-uncle to inform him of the encounter, and promptly went to sleep. The following day she decided to head to the hotel bar for a glass of wine. She struck up a conversation with the bartender and informed him of the bizarre incident. At first she was reluctant to share any information with him, concerned that he wouldn't believe her. But the bartender had no issues believing her. He merely smiled and said, "Yeah, that kid's been here for years." My great-aunt never uncovered any explanation behind the experience or what may have possibly been going through the boy's mind. Unfortunately, I have long since forgotten the name of the hotel they stayed at, and may never discover the truth for myself. Stick Indians by Can't Unsee It. In 1987, I was looking for and purchased a 1+ acre lot for $3,000 off an Indian reservation in Mason County, Washington, about 30 minutes from my work. I was making payments as I lived there, and I paid off the property in 1989. I would go out to the property whenever I had time. It was a beautiful drive up the river, with the winding river down below on my left and steep hillside to the right. The road was cut out of the hill. It was more like a bumpy logging road. I headed up to go to camp on my property one weekend, and prior to that I had always just waved at the native man, a woman, and 3 kids when I drove by if they were outside. On this day, I decided to stop and introduce myself, so I pulled down into the driveway of the property with trash everywhere. I started walking up to the porch and noticed to my left two white blobs that I eventually realized were perfectly skinned large beavers lying on their backs, lined up like trophies. Seeing this made me sad. They weren't for food, just for pelts. So I knocked and introduced myself, telling the native I had purchased property about a mile up the river from him. I told him I'd be camping on the property and playing around the river, and he told me that the Indians don't sleep in the woods there because of the stick Indians. I don't remember too much more about our conversation. But as I was leaving, he wanted to show me his catch from a recent saltwater fishing trip down the road from there. I followed him to the other side of the boat in his yard, and I saw 15 very small, illegal-sized red cod that had been filleted and thrown everywhere. After seeing that, I really wanted to get out of there, so I headed to my property. I had no issues at the property and eventually had my A-frame style chalet home built, finally moving in by mid-1990. I didn't have any power for 6 months and no water for over a year. I was single at the time I moved in, and my bedroom was in the upper half of the top floor of the chalet, called a crow's nest, and I could look down into my living room. The A-frame peak was in the middle of my bed, and the upper floor walls leaned into the peak, kind of cramped around the bed. The window was directly above the head of my bed, and no drapes were needed at that height. I was alone in the woods, after all. On one night, I was awakened by an all-consuming constant high-vibration rattle. If you can picture a wood tube half filled with 500 metal BBs in it being shaken as fast as possible, that would be as close to what I could describe as the sound. Or maybe shaking seeds in an oversized pod times 1,000. It was so hard to describe the constant and rhythmic deafening sound it was making throughout my house and the upstairs room. I can't give this justice in words. I quickly sat up in bed and thought maybe there was a craft above my home. But looking out the window, it was dark, and I could see the trees 10 feet away out at my bedroom window. When the rattling started, scared may not be the perfect word for me, but maybe disbelief or partial panic. The sound was a menacing, overwhelming rattle that lasted maybe 10 minutes or longer, and it freaked me out. I couldn't imagine having been sleeping outside or in a tent and hearing that. I was 12 feet off the ground in my home, protected by wood walls, after all. In the 8 years I owned that property, that only happened once and in the dark. I wondered later if it was the stick Indians and maybe they weren't happy, and maybe that was them voicing their opinion. Ghost with Mental Illness by Tweed. Over the years, hearing all these ghost stories and paranormal stories, I've found some hauntings so bizarre for the people experiencing them. But if viewed through the perspective of a ghost who lived with a mental illness, could follow some logic. Obviously, not all hauntings can be or shouldn't be explained away by a mental illness. I don't believe everyone necessarily carries their emotional mental state with them on the other side. But I've come to believe occasionally some do to some extent for one reason or another. If I didn't know the woman/ghost in this haunting, I don't know if I'd have connected the dots. I'd like you to meet V, my stepmom's mother. V was and is a pretty typical Australian woman. Wicked sense of humor, very outspoken, and opinionated about everything. Friendly, always up for a chat. Never without a cigarette or two on the go. Loved animals, had a lot of pets. Hated swearing. Her catchphrase would be, "Don't swear!" It's what she'd yell if she ever heard you swearing. My stepmom's father swore a fair bit, and their pet parrot learned to repeat, "Don't swear!" in V's voice. It was pretty classic. V passed away in 1995 after a long struggle with something. She didn't want her family to know what she was dying from, but everyone assumed it was lung-related because she chain-smoked her entire life. Her family likely knew towards the end, but I have never known. My stepmother had a long interest in what used to be known as multiple personality disorder. Now known as dissociative identity disorder, V likely suffered from this condition throughout her life. However, she was never formally diagnosed. Partly because she didn't trust doctors, and partly because this condition was seldom taken seriously in the mainstream back then. Therefore, research and findings were scarce. Regardless of what you call it, This condition presents as distinct breaks in personality and identity, dizzy or fainting spells, memory or time loss, severe headaches, and migraines. It's brought on by severe and chronic early childhood trauma, with the majority being chronic sexual abuse at an early age. I've known V since I've known my stepmom, C, which would be since around 1987 when I was about 6. My stepmother, C, told me about the condition when I was about 12. I remember saying how I thought that stuff only happened in movies. I couldn't believe it. She went on to tell me how it's formed and the criteria for diagnosis, and I have to admit, as a young lass, I found it morbidly fascinating. It wasn't until years after V's passing that C told me why and how she became interested in the condition. Up until I was about 20, I didn't know anything was wrong with V. C began telling me the things V used to do, most things I had no knowledge of, and how V had ticked every diagnosis criteria. I began to understand a handful of bizarre behaviors I'd witnessed from V growing up. While V was alive, I wasn't around her long enough to really notice much, but for a handful of moments. I probably averaged about 2 to 3 hours with V at a time, around 4 times a year, so not a lot of time to build a big picture. The first time V haunted me was not long after she passed, mid-1990s. We, that is, my brother and I, stayed at Dad and C's place every second weekend. C had lost a piece of jewelry. I don't remember exactly what it was, but C was sure she'd lost it at home, and she was getting herself distraught. She spent the afternoon and evening looking everywhere. We were asked not to wear shoes inside and not to walk along the perimeter of the lounge room in case it had fallen off a windowsill. Stepmom wasn't the tidiest person. But anyway, she couldn't find it. That evening or the next morning, I had a dream. In the dream it was morning, and I floated from the spare room where I slept, down the hallway, through the lounge room, into the kitchen. V was sitting on a kitchen chair directly in front of the fridge. I floated up to her and she said, "Tell T it's behind the curtain." I woke up. It was morning. I don't remember if I got up or went back to sleep. In the dream, V called my stepmom C by the nickname her family called her. And it might be worth mentioning, I had started reading about astral travel and the like at the time, which may have made a difference. Stepmom didn't believe in anything supernatural, so I was definitely not going to pass on the message. But later that evening, she found her jewelry behind the curtain in their bedroom. I thought it would be behind the lounge curtain and had been waiting for an opportunity to go look. We were still under instruction not to walk the perimeter of that room lest we trod on it. They had the carpet from hell back then. It swallowed everything. The rest of the night was my exasperated dad yelling about why couldn't she look after her jewelry better, and how could she not know what room it was in, etc. Stepmom still puts jewelry in random places. In the dream, V was sitting in front of the fridge. For reasons unknown to me, the fridge was off limits for us kids while in V's presence. I know it had something to do with opening the door all the way, and looking back now, I say it was kind of a trigger for her. Whenever she was there, the fridge would be open the least amount possible, regardless of whose place you were at. V hoarded scissors. I don't know why. Their kitchen was filled with pairs of scissors. Apparently the kitchen drawers were packed full of more scissors. I mean, just so many scissors. Over 10 years ago, I had a pair of scissors go missing. I was doing some gardening and came in to get the scissors for the packaging of I don't recall what, but I couldn't find the scissors. I'm the opposite of my stepmom. I know where everything is, and I'm pretty fastidious about it. But after a day or so, I bought a new pair of scissors, put them in the same place the old ones were, in a cup on the kitchen bench. The same day I came back inside from gardening, and there's the old scissors on the bench, clear as day, next to the cup. The new ones were still standing in. I started thinking about V and scissors and wondered if she wanted me to start a scissors collection. This reminds me of all the times as a teenager the scissors would go missing in the home, which made me wonder if she was to blame for all those scissors too. I found the whole notion extremely annoying. Scissors went AWOL a few times after that and would turn up a few days later in some obvious place somewhere in the kitchen. But I didn't buy any new ones. When B, V's husband and stepmom's father, passed away, the scissors activity stopped. B was a great guy and had a calming effect on V, so I was glad it appeared that the same thing was happening in the hereafter. But I believe on this occasion, it was V. Stepmom and I were driving down the freeway. I was the passenger. It was the afternoon, and there had been some strong wind the previous night. A lot of branches were scattered around the road, and Stepmom commented that the council had chosen the wrong kind of trees for that location. Then there was a bang on or in the car. I got a fright, but Stepmom didn't. She just kept talking about the council. I said I thought there was a branch stuck in the wheel well, but Stepmom said it was okay. There was no more noise, but I kept watching the passenger side mirror, waiting for a branch to be flung somewhere. Then there was another bang. These bangs were really loud. I suggested we pull over because it didn't sound like the kind of noise you ignore, but Stepmom brushed it off, and there were a couple more bangs. I started to wonder if the bangs were coinciding with unladylike language. C changed the subject, but the bangs timed thusly. C said, "I've been watching Downton Abbey." Me, "What are you watching that shit for?" Bang! C, "I know, your father hates it too. But there was this bit, you would have loved it. This guy's ulcer burst and it was fucking brilliant. Bang! The only thing that shit me was bang! The blood should have been black, and there should have been way more of it." She then told me about these burst ulcers at the hospital where she worked, and there was more banging. I said it was naive to expect Martin Scorsese realism in a production aimed at the Agatha Christie audience, which sort of ended the topic. The banging ended when C stopped talking about Downton Abbey and hospital gore. It's very odd being the only one taking something that bizarre that seriously. I wondered if the banging was V visiting for Christmas because it seemed to time with the swearing. Plus, V hated any talk of gore. It could have been my father's maid banging for joy at the gruesome discussion, which I could also believe. But I doubt it because the banging was in the car too, and it was so violent. It seemed angry, not like the foot-stomping Dad's mate would do. A few years ago, I had a bit of a meltdown after Christmas. The event is what tipped me. A few days after the car thing, I was at Dad and C's for a New Year's or Christmas event. Back then I used to visit Melbourne for a few weeks at Christmas, and I would either borrow cars or carpool from here to there. That evening, Dad was driving me back to Mum's place. It was getting late, everyone had left, the weather was cold, and their heater was on. Melbourne summers are weird. There was a Christmas card on top of the mantel clock, and the warm air from the gas heater was rising in just the right spot to make the card and the clock do a jig. It swayed from side to side, and as I noticed it, I said, "Hey, look, the ghost of Christmas past." Unbeknownst to me, that was the worst thing to say. Dad had a brief defensive reaction until he saw the card. Stepmom came in from another room, also a bit defensive, asking, "What's this?" I explained about the card, but then she calmed down. Then I asked Dad about a ghost he saw many years ago, to which he said, "Oh yeah, I saw that." But then he all of a sudden snapped and shouted, "But I don't know what it was. There's no such thing as ghosts, and I didn't see any ghost, and there's no afterlife or heaven." You get the idea. It was suddenly on like Donkey Kong. My dad, the guy I used to talk about ghosts with when I was a kid, had suddenly turned into Richard Dawkins, seemingly out of nowhere. Then my stepmom started talking about how they've proved that people who see ghosts are having a type of epileptic seizure. While Dad still yelled about having never seen any ghosts, things went on for 10 minutes in the house and continued in the car on the drive back. All the freaking way until I bid them goodbye and went inside. These strange bangs lasted half an hour. I usually get car seat in the back seat, so Dad and stepmom always liked me in the front. The drive back sucked. Dad wouldn't calm down. I kind of went numb and tried not to prod the beast any further. But stepmom kept chiming in from the back seat about how she loves that people never see animal ghosts, only human ghosts. I bit my tongue there. I knew what was going on, and they were feeding off of one another, and I opted out of that discussion. Stepmom said something which prompted me to look around the back at her, doing so out of politeness. I don't remember exactly what was said, just that it was something anti-ghost. But I saw two people in the back seat, instead of just her. Stepmom was sitting behind the driver's seat looking out of the passenger window, which I thought was odd because she was addressing me. A split second after I noticed the other figure in the back, I noticed it had V's tracksuit pants and slippers on, and her black jumper. One of the few behavioral shifts I'd seen from V growing up was that sometimes V had a black jumper on. That was strange because she hated black. She hated people wearing black and said it looked like you were dressed for a funeral. She always wore colorful clothing, and whenever she had the black jumper on, she was aloof. No eye contact except if it was to yell briefly at someone for coming near her. She always seemed like she wanted to be left alone. It didn't make much sense. I knew about depression as a child, and I think I must have assumed something along those lines. Anyway, I looked at the face of the figure in the black jumper and saw V's glasses and hair, but her skin looked burned or charred. I can't say how transparent or solid this apparition was because I looked straight ahead immediately and stayed fixed on the road ahead and my shoes for the rest of the journey. I also don't know if my stepmom saw anything or if that's why she turned in the other direction. I can only assume that all this dialogue really pissed V off enough to tip her over the edge. I don't know what the charred appearance was all about, and perhaps that's how part of her perceives herself. I wonder if the heightened emotion in the car made it easy for her to appear in the back. And I also wondered how long she'd been there. Had she followed us from the house? Or was she in the car all the time? How long had she been in black jumper mode? Was black jumper mode responsible for the banging on the car the other day? So many questions. Pretty shaken up that evening, I got home and immediately asked my guardian to take V, black jumper alter, back to her husband B or back to wherever she should be, because it wasn't healthy for her to be there. That was the last time I was visited by V. I've had a couple of dreams about her, though. In these dreams, she's herself. She tells me to tell everyone she's still here, so probably a visitation dream? One of my grandmothers does this too, but more politely. I think they've teamed up in the afterlife. Like my stepmom, I've carried on learning about the condition over the years, and my feeling is it's part of PTSD, but it's how PTSD manifests itself within a developing mind, and as such requires different treatment and diagnoses. It's astonishing the ability of the mind to preserve itself. Whatever condition V had in life seems to have followed her. I guess whatever you don't deal with in life, you must deal with on the other side. But according to the dreams I have, she's doing okay now. Anyone could be forgiven for thinking demon or another entity if they'd seen V in the back of the car. But I know it was her, and I don't know what I would have thought had I not known her. The Haunted Warehouse by Nate 800. True story, honor system. I work in a warehouse that my father purchased. He bought it for 25% of its cost from a farmer who seemed very excited to be rid of it. It's in the middle of Mennonite country with no neighbors for a half-mile around. Look out the window and you see cornfields and scraggly trees. Cell service? Forget about it. I worked there alone, painting and prepping it for the front office portion for eventual functionality. To get to the front office, you must go through a hallway from the main warehouse into a secondary office, and then through another door into the front. I frequently heard bumps and thuds, and I occasionally went into the warehouse and felt air movement, but I've always attributed it to drafts and animal life in the roof. The only thing that has ever made me uneasy about the building is the fact that all of the door locks are reversed. Whoever installed those locks didn't intend to keep people out. They intended to keep something in. I was in the front office when I began to hear the thudding. I ignored it and continued to apply masking tape to the door I was working on. But this time, it was accompanied by a screeching sound. Not loud, but audible. I was freaked out, but convinced myself that it was just a pissed-off raccoon or squirrel that had found its way inside. I continued working until I heard the slam. The door to the secondary office had been open. It sounded like it had violently slammed shut. I peeked around the corner and saw that I was right. The secondary door was now closed. I tried to logic it through in my head that a strong draft had sucked it closed, although I knew there was no such draft. The thudding began again, closer this time. I wasn't able to put a proximity on it, but now it sounded like it was right on the other side of the door. I froze, unsure of what was happening. My eyes locked on the door handle, which began to turn. The door disengaged its latch and slowly swung open. Wider and wider. There was nothing there. Nothing visible, no air movement, just quiet. So quiet. A quiet that seemed to overwhelm me with its presence. A quiet so thick I couldn't breathe. The quiet was shattered when the screech came. This time, it was clearly human. Pained, angered, and emanating from the main warehouse. The door slammed. That entirely broke my frozen, fearful state. I ran. I got into my car and drove until I was in cell range to call my father. He didn't believe anything about the doors closing, but agreed that the building had something weird about it. He told me he'd be right out. Fast forward half an hour. My dad and I met up and drove back to the warehouse. I showed him the door that slammed, showing him that it was separated from both the front office and the main warehouse, so no draft could have closed it. I told him about the thuds, the screeching, and the sudden quiet that overcame the building. He decided that we should check the main warehouse. Emboldened by his presence, I led the way. Something you should know about this warehouse. It was formerly a furniture manufacturing place owned by a Mennonite farmer. They made handmade chairs, tables, etc., and because of all the cutting that went on, the floor was thickly coated with dust. We walked into the warehouse and saw nothing out of the ordinary. The dust was untouched, the doors were closed, and the windows were locked. The only thing out of the ordinary was one of the hanging fluorescent light fixtures. It was hanging askew and swaying slightly. Insisting we take a look at the mount to ensure it didn't just break loose, my dad grabbed a stepladder and he supported it while I climbed up and grabbed the swinging light. I looked on top of the light and saw a handprint. A single, fresh, inhumanly large handprint. No footprints in the dust around the light. No signs of a presence. I climbed down and switched places with my father. He saw it and said, "What the hell? There hasn't been anyone out here for years." He climbed down and told me he'd been suspicious of someone breaking in and stealing parts from the warehouse light system. He couldn't believe me that this wasn't human, that something wasn't right there. The last thing he said was, "Nothing's here. Next time, just go back to work." And then, as if to show its presence, the thud returned. This time it wasn't just a thud, more of an earthquake. The entire building felt like it moved. The heartbeat-like thud was then overlaid by the screech. That awful, awful screech. It felt like it was coming from the walls themselves. We ran. We ran and I haven't returned. My father hired someone to finish my job and has since moved into the office. He's heard the thudding, but thus far nothing else has happened. But what actually happened? I don't know. Nor do I ever care to know. What I do know is that there is something paranormal in that building, and the man who sold it to us knew. I'll never forget the sound of that lock turning by itself, or the feeling of that deafening silence. The Bomb Dump by Nero Joe. Former Air Force here. I was a munition systems technician, and I worked in a very large storage facility called a bomb dump in Europe. This place had dozens of buildings, including many earth-covered magazines called igloos housing thousands of bombs. This facility was pretty big. It was about 9 square miles, I think. An interesting thing about this bomb dump was that it was completely forested and populated with wildlife. Most are deforested because of the fire hazard, but the country that this bomb dump was in required that the area be maintained as a natural preserve. Now, despite having a small deer population, this forest wasn't nice and clear. Most forests have a fire or two to clear them out every 20 years or so. This forest had played host to munitions storage since WW2 and had no fires since. It was thick, dark, and dank. The trees were so overgrown that you would be hard-pressed to see 10 yards in a straight line. Anyway, it was a pretty creepy place at night. Hell, it was a pretty creepy place in the daytime. Twice a day, we had to run a security check to make sure that no holes had been cut through the fence and all the buildings were closed and locked. However, this wasn't the job of the swing shifters. We were a skeleton crew. The checks were run by the morning and afternoon crews, unless, of course, they fucked up, which they did one afternoon. The one guy in control doesn't realize that no PM security check was run until about 1 a.m. Since no one was working dispatch, he just walked down to our hall office and asked us to run it. We had finished all of our work early, so we were playing split-screen Halo, which was new at the time. Me and my friend Brian volunteered to take a truck out and run the check, so we grabbed a walkie-talkie and a flashlight and headed out. First, we ran the perimeter, about an 8 or 12 mile trip, but we had to go about 15 miles an hour tops, so it took quite a while. When we started building check, it was about 2 a.m. We began at the back. I can't remember how it went now, but we had an efficient system for checking every building without having to double back. Anyway, we started as far back from our building and coworkers as possible. Well, Brian decided that a piss and a cigarette were in order before we began the building check, which would take us another hour or so. He shut the truck off, dropped the tailgate, and we just sat and chilled in utter darkness while he burned down his cig. To this day, I don't know why he shut that ignition off. When we hopped back in and tried to start the truck again, nothing happened. The ignition simply didn't fire. No attempted turnover, no sputter and fail, just silence. It must have been an electrical problem. Well, fuck. We both thought it and said it simultaneously. Control, this is Storage 1. We're broke down out here. Silence. Control, we're out past Building 70. We need a ride. You copy? Silence. We tried the walkie-talkie for a good 15 minutes before we realized that we would be walking back. Now, we could have stuck to the road. There were no streetlights, but at least we would know where we were going. We would have to walk about a mile northward to the main corridor and then turn east for another 3 miles. Not too bad. But for some reason, we thought it would be much faster to take a shortcut through the forest. I actually knew this was a shitty idea, but I had a man card to preserve, so I went along with the idea. No matter what logical idea I came up with for sticking to the road, it always sounded like, I'm a giant pussy, when I said it in my head. So I trudged out into the woods with Brian. You'd think that Brian had balls of steel. You'd think that he would shrug off any spooky shit just to save some face. This was all his testosterone-laden idea anyway, after all. Well, that wasn't so. Brian was scared shitless about 10 minutes in. Now, I wasn't too scared. I knew it was a bad idea, but I wasn't about to lose it or anything. However, Brian's anxiety was strong and I could sense it. And worst of all, it was getting increasingly contagious. Walking through the thick woods is slow. Neither of us had watches on, and our cell phones were back in our lockers. Before, we just went off the clock in the truck, but that truck was a quarter mile away now. So we had no real idea what time it was, but we were too far in the woods to go back. I knew that we weren't going in a straight line. We were meandering about, but I did know that we should have almost been to one of the rows of buildings. It was probably only 20 minutes since we had left the truck, but it might as well have been hours when we reached the row of buildings. These were old buildings, above-ground brick structures, not the concrete igloos. The above-ground magazines had specially designed roofs that would blow upwards in the event of a catastrophic explosion, minimizing damage to nearby structures. They were also some of the oldest buildings in the bomb dump, little newer than WW2 itself. They were ramshacked, rusted, and coated in moss. Inside they were dank and moldy. The only thing we kept in them were plain Mk-82 bomb bodies, the least expensive and least sensitive stock that we had. The only saving grace about these buildings was the dim industrial lights over their doorways. While not ideal, the soft orange glow was a welcome break from our flashlight. We started walking down the gravel road that these buildings lined. We passed one, then another, and another. Then... Holy fucking shit, Joe. One of the buildings was open. The big steel blast doors were sealed, but the side door for personnel to use was propped open with a fucking rock. Control, this is Storage 1. Building 62 is not secure. Silence. Did you get that, Control? Building 62 is open. Silence. I looked at Brian. You know, we have to check this out, right? Though it was too dark to tell, I'm pretty sure Brian went a little pale. Yep. We approached the door like Osama bin Laden was going to jump out with his fucking scimitar and gut us. After all, we didn't have weapons on us. I stuck my head in. Hello? I felt a chill roll over me as I entered. Brian followed. It stunk in the building. It smelled like wet concrete and mildew. I shined the flashlight down a row of bombs. There were hundreds in there. When I was satisfied, we headed back to the doorway. We didn't have the keys to lock it up, but at least we could say that it was secure. That's when I heard it. The most blood-curdling scream I have ever heard. My heart went into my fucking throat. Brian just ran. I just followed him. We ran all the way out of the building, across the road, and into the trees across the drive. What the fuck? Brian was shaking. I'm pretty sure that I was too. I'm not sure how I got out of breath. We only ran about 20 yards from the building, but it felt like I had just run a fucking marathon. I hunkered down, resting my palms on my knee. What the fuck was that? It sounded like a fucking banshee, man, Brian said. Then my heart sank. Oh, Jesus. We left the door open. Just fuck it, said Brian. Dude, we can't. We already called it in. We'd be fucked. For the next minute or 10, we just sat there panting, watching the door. Whatever was in there, it seemed to have no interest in following us out. Brian and I looked at each other and knew that we had to go shut the door. We both began walking up to it slowly. I was careful not to shine the flashlight into the door. I didn't want to get the attention of whatever was in there. We paused about 3 feet from the door. We'll just shut it, dude. And we did. I slid the rock away with my foot, and Brian gently closed the door. Not another noise came from Building 62. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on my podcast or channel, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Hit the notification button for every time I upload, and follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. If you'd like to take it a step further and support the channel, you can find me on Patreon. A link to that is also in the description. I did throw in one of the classics on this one, the bomb dump. I heard that years and years ago on a collaboration with some of the heavyweights on YouTube, and always liked it, so I tracked it down and present it here to you. I'm going to continue doing that going forward in the future, because I do realize a lot of those classics have been taken down for whatever reason, and we need to make sure that they're preserved for people to hear going forward. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, Be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.